Imagine waking up one day in a world where your job, your savings, and even your next meal are uncertain. This was the reality for millions during the Great Depression. It was a time of immense economic collapse, where the familiar comforts of daily life were swept away in a tide of hardship and scarcity. Yet, it was also a time of incredible resilience and ingenuity, a time when people learned to adapt, survive, and even thrive in the face of adversity. The Great Depression was more than just a financial crisis. It was a seismic shift that shook the very foundations of society, forcing people to rethink and reevaluate their way of life. But how exactly did they cope? How did they keep food on the table when jobs were scarce and money was even scarcer? How did they stay warm when coal was a luxury they could barely afford? The answers to these questions lie in the survival strategies that people developed during those challenging years. They learned to stretch every ingredient, to make the most of their resources, to rely on the kindness of neighbors and the bounty of the land. They turned to gardening for survival, growing their own food in backyards, empty lots, and even rooftops. They mastered the art of canning and preserving, ensuring they had food to last through the long, harsh winter. They hunted and foraged, scouring the woods for small game and edible plants. But survival was about more than just food. It was about finding shelter, staying warm, and keeping clothes on their backs. It was about bartering, trading, and making do with less. It was about community, about helping each other, about standing together in the face of adversity. And most importantly, it was about hope, about the belief that they could and would survive, no matter what. Despite these hardships, people found creative ways to survive. They didn't just endure the Great Depression, they learned from it, drawing lessons and strategies that we can still apply today. So let's delve into these survival strategies. Let's explore how people made it through one of the toughest periods in history, and let's discover how we can apply these lessons to our own lives. When store shelves were empty and money was scarce, how did people keep their families fed? Let's turn the clock back to the 1930s, a time when food shortages were a stark reality, and innovative solutions were the key to survival. People had to stretch every ingredient to its maximum potential. This was a time of rationing and meal planning, where every scrap of food was precious. Imagine meals like Hoover stew, a humble concoction of canned vegetables, hot dogs, and macaroni, or bread made without yeast, a staple that required creativity and resourcefulness. Even the humble dandelion, often overlooked today, was boiled and served as a nutritious green. These were the meals that kept families going when food was scarce. But people didn't just rely on what they could find in stores. They turned their own backyards into survival hubs. Victory gardens, named to inspire a sense of patriotism and self-sufficiency, sprouted up everywhere. These gardens, blooming in backyards, empty lots, and even rooftops, became invaluable sources of fresh produce. A single victory garden could yield enough vegetables to feed a family through the leanest times. Preservation also became a vital skill. With no guarantee of store-bought food, people mastered the art of canning fruits and vegetables, fermenting pickles and sauerkraut, and smoking meats to last through the winter. These techniques allowed families to extend the shelf life of their food, ensuring they had something to eat even in the harshest months. Hunting and foraging also became critical skills. Small game like rabbits and squirrels, often overlooked in today's culinary world, were vital protein sources. And a deep knowledge of wild edible plants could mean the difference between a meal and an empty stomach. Foraging wasn't just a hobby, it was a survival skill that could feed a family when nothing else was available. These strategies kept families nourished when food was limited. But food wasn't the only shortage. Let's explore how people dealt with a lack of cash. In times of economic hardship, cash becomes a luxury many can't afford. So how did people get what they needed? Well, the answer lies in the lost art of bartering and trading. You see, in the 1930s, when wallets were thin and banknotes were scarce, folks had to get creative. They turned to the age-old practice of bartering, exchanging goods and services without the need for money. Imagine this. A farmer with a surplus of eggs but a leaky roof could trade with a roofer who had a hungry family to feed. The farmer gets his roof fixed and the roofer gets his family fed. It was a win-win situation, and no money exchanged hands. Now let's not forget about trading. Maybe you had some spare firewood and your neighbor had extra canned goods. Why not strike up a trade? This way, both parties could benefit from the exchange, and again, no cash was required. But it wasn't just goods that were traded. Skills became a form of currency too. Mechanics, seamstresses, carpenters, and other skilled laborers suddenly found themselves in high demand. They could trade their expertise for food, clothing, or other necessities. In this system, everyone had something to offer. It was a community effort, and it kept people going when times were tough. It was about survival, yes, but it was also about solidarity and cooperation. But bartering and trading were more than just practical solutions. They represented a shift in mindset. People started seeing the value in things beyond their price tags. They saw the worth in skills, in resources, and most importantly, in each other. So what can we learn from this? Well, in a world where cash is king, it's easy to forget that it's not the only way to get what we need. And who knows, if we ever find ourselves in a similar situation, we might just find that these old-school strategies are just as relevant today. Trade and bartering kept communities functioning, but how did people keep a roof over their heads and stay warm? Keeping a roof over your head and staying warm became a challenge during the Great Depression. How did families cope? Many had to think outside the box and use every resource they could find. One of the most common solutions was multifamily households. Brothers, sisters, cousins, grandparents, and even friends would often live together under one roof. This communal living wasn't just about sharing space, it was about pooling resources. Insulation was another significant concern. With the cold winter months, keeping heat inside was crucial. People turned to whatever materials they had at hand to seal drafts in their homes. Cardboard, newspapers, and even mud were used to fill in gaps and cracks. It wasn't pretty, but it was effective. Finding fuel to keep homes warm was another hurdle. Wood and coal were the main sources of heat, but they weren't always easy to come by. People had to get creative, often scouring abandoned buildings and train tracks for scraps of wood and discarded coal. This wasn't just about staying warm, it was about survival. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Despite the hardships, there were moments of joy, camaraderie, and even innovation. People learned to make the most of what they had, finding new ways to use old things, and discovering that they were capable of more than they ever thought possible. The Great Depression was a time of great struggle, but it was also a time of remarkable resilience. It forced people to think differently, to be resourceful, and to rely on each other in ways they never had before. It was a time when people truly learned the value of community, of sharing, and of making the most of what you have. Shelter and warmth were crucial, but so was clothing. Let's see how people managed with less. Clothing is a basic necessity, but during the Great Depression it became a luxury. How did people adapt? Well, during those tough times, people had to be incredibly resourceful and creative, making do with what they had. Clothing was no exception. New clothes were a rare luxury, so people had to find ways to extend the life of their existing wardrobe. Hand-me-downs became the norm, with clothes being passed down through generations or among neighbors. Clothing was patched, restitched, and repurposed until it couldn't be used anymore. A single garment could have many lives. An adult's coat might become a child's jacket and then a rag rug. But what about when clothes were beyond repair? Enter feed sack clothing. During the Depression, companies started printing flour and feed sacks with patterns. This wasn't just a marketing gimmick, it was a lifeline for many families. These patterned sacks could be transformed into dresses, shirts, and even underwear. It's a fascinating example of how necessity can spark innovation. But let's not forget about footwear. Shoes, often overlooked, were just as important and just as difficult to replace. When shoes wore out, people got creative. Old tires were repurposed with their rubber used to patch worn soles. When things got really tough, some people even resorted to wrapping their feet in rags or newspaper. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than going barefoot. So you see, during the Great Depression, clothing wasn't just about fashion. It was about survival. It was about making do with what you had and finding creative solutions to problems. It was about resilience, resourcefulness, and the human spirit. Clothing was one challenge, but earning money was another. Let's see how people managed. In a time when jobs were scarce, how did people earn money to survive? This is a question that brings us to the heart of human resilience and creativity. When conventional employment vanished, people turned to any means possible to scrape together a livelihood. Odd jobs and side hustles became the norm. Men, women, and even children found work wherever they could, shining shoes, selling newspapers, chopping wood, or taking in laundry. These jobs might not have been glamorous, but they were essential, providing a few cents here, a dollar there, which could mean the difference between an empty stomach and a warm meal. In addition to these small jobs, many people also found ways to monetize their homes. With a roof over their heads being a luxury that not everyone could afford, Homeowners often turned their homes into boarding houses. They rented out rooms to travelers or those who had lost their jobs, providing a place to sleep in exchange for a small fee. Meanwhile, the spirit of self-sufficiency thrived. Homesteading became more than just a lifestyle, it was a means of survival. Families raised chickens in their backyards for eggs, kept goats for milk, and maintained beehives for honey. These weren't just food sources, they were commodities that could be traded or sold. But perhaps the most important aspect of these survival strategies was their adaptability. People learned to take advantage of their skills, their resources, and their circumstances, and to adapt to the demands of their time. They did whatever it took to make ends meet, proving that when it comes to survival, ingenuity and resilience are just as valuable as any job. So what can we learn from this? Perhaps it's that in the face of adversity, we can find ways to persevere, we can adapt, we can innovate, and we can thrive, no matter how dire the circumstances might seem. Money was important, but so was community. Let's see the role of community in survival. In tough times, community can be a lifeline. How did communities come together during the Great Depression? The answer to that lies in the power of mutual aid and the spirit of human resilience. Let's take a closer look. During the Depression, soup kitchens and charity groups sprung up across the nation. But these weren't just government initiatives. They were grassroots efforts by neighbors, churches, and communities who banded together to take care of each other. A loaf of bread here, a pot of soup there, every little bit helped. But aid didn't just come in the form of food, it was also about lending a helping hand. There was an unspoken rule of survival. If you had extra, you shared it. If you were in need, you worked in exchange for food. A neighbor might fix a leaky roof in return for a hot meal, or a child might run errands in exchange for a pair of shoes. In the face of scarcity, frugality became a lifestyle. Nothing was thrown away, nothing was considered useless. People saved everything, string, jars, buttons, scrap fabric, because nothing was disposable. In this way, resources were stretched, waste was minimized, and every scrap was put to good use. Creativity also played a key role in these hard times. Kids found joy in homemade toys, while adults turned to storytelling, music, and gatherings to lift spirits and foster a sense of community. The simple pleasures of life became a beacon of hope, a reminder that joy could be found even in the darkest of times. In essence, the Great Depression brought out the best in humanity. It showed us that in times of crisis we are stronger together. It reminded us of the power of community and the importance of mutual aid. The Great Depression was a time of hardship, but also of resilience and ingenuity. These survival strategies are a testament to human adaptability and can serve as a guide for any tough times ahead.